Yeah, and before we start, like with usually our first questions about your background and your path in higher ed, we both have a certain person we know, and he's a good friend of mine, a friend of the podcast, prior guest on the podcast, and that is Michael Giroux, or as some of us call him, Mike G. So I wanted to kind of start actually with this question: who is Mike G to you?
Yeah, so Mike G is actually my direct supervisor, also known as mentor, because Mike will often mentor me even outside the position, just to kind of help me understand the ins and outs of higher education, how to navigate the bureaucracy, things like that, or even just someone I could just lean on when I need to talk to about some issues I'm experiencing in my professional career. So go, Mike. Love Mike.
So I had told Mike that we were going to be recording together for the podcast, and so I said, tell me about Zach. And so this is what he wrote back to me. He said, Zach is one of the most passionate and enthusiastic higher ed professionals I have had the pleasure of working with. He has a special gift when it comes to making students feel welcome, seen, and heard as he learns about their individual stories, especially those who are first generation. His compassion and dedication runs deep with supporting both his students and his colleagues as they work to achieve their desired goals. Zach's approach to academic advising is purposeful and always centered around remember their why. So Zach, tell us about you. What's been your journey in higher ed?
Yeah, so I would say my journey in higher education is actually a very unique one, and it's kind of a long story, but I'll try to keep it brief as much as possible. But basically, I would say the first time I was actually ever exposed to higher education and understand what higher education was truly all about and everything was when I was in ninth grade. I remember sitting in a classroom. I remember my English teacher, Mrs. Fall. So shout out to Mrs. Fall if you're watching this. I miss you very much, and she was a big part of my life, especially growing up in adolescence in the small town of Shazy, New York. And she said we had a guest speaker coming to speak to class, and her name was Julie Kuhn. Once again, shout out to Julie Kuhn. Julie Kuhn was actually an Upward Bound counselor. And I remember she was telling us about this program that she worked for called Upward Bound. And it was at SUNY Plattsburgh, which was 20 minutes from where I actually grew up in Shazy. And she says, hey, we have this program called Upward Bound. It's for people who are first in their family to go to college, or people who come from low-income backgrounds, or students who may have learning disabilities, invisible or visible disabilities as well. And Julie says, basically what we have is a summer program where you're going to take some college classes or even classes that are just going to prepare you for the following year of school and all that kind of stuff. We also get to go on trips. She even showed us this awesome video of like things that they did in the previous summer, which I thought was so cool. And I was like, dang, that sounds so cool. Like, I would love to be a part of that. I mean, it must cost $1 million. You know what I mean? Because I didn't know how much $1 million truly was. You know what I mean? And then Julie said that her famous catchphrase was, and guess how much the program cost? And everyone guessed. And I think I guessed like maybe $250 or $300 at the time. And she's like, well, joke's on all of you. It's actually free. And I was like, what? That's crazy. So I remember I came home and I rushed to tell my parents, like, Mom, Dad, hey, this is really kind of cool. There's this program called Upward Bound and all this kind of stuff. We should really kind of check it out and everything. I'm like, I would love to do that. I think it would kind of really help me because at that time, I always really wanted to go to college. I had some big aspirations and everything. And I was like, I really want to go to college. I think this can help prepare me for that. And so my parents filled out the paperwork, you know what I mean? And I remember the day, I think it was like sometime in like April, I believe, maybe April or May, I got a letter in the mail that said, congratulations, you've been accepted to the Upward Bound program. And I remember I was just being so enthusiastic. I was so excited. Those times when I was in Upward Bound as a student were some of the best summers of my life, even to this day. I met some of my closest friends possible. One of my current roommates, actually, fun fact, we were both obviously roommates in Upward Bound, and we actually were roommates all the years of Upward Bound together. This person's also going to become part of my wedding party someday when I get married because we're like that close. Nice. I even still keep in touch with a lot of people I made friends with in high school. But because of that, like I said, that program really prepared me for exposure to higher education. Mm-hmm. Then I remember I graduated and I had this really big dream. I really wanted to go to this one school, and I really put all my eggs in one basket. And I remember the day right before I was actually supposed to leave to actually go to the college and stuff to move in, my dad just says, hey, everything is good, right? Like, you don't have to worry about anything. I'm like, no, I think everything's fine. And my dad's like, you may just want to call just to make sure things are good before you move in, because I was planning to go to school in near the Rochester area of Rochester, New York, and everything. And so I called them, and they told me like, hey, I just wanted to let you know we were trying to recalculate your financially because I guess there must have been an error that exists. And unfortunately, you owe the college around $6,000.
Wow.
And I was like, what? $6,000? Like, I didn't even, like, to me, like, that was a ton of money, and it still is even to this day.
Yeah.
And I told myself when I was like, oh, well, what can I do? Can I do like a payment plan? Is there things I could do? Everything, but we need that money within the first 2 weeks of school.
Mm-hmm.
And I come from a very low-income family. Both my parents worked extremely hard. In the fall of 2008, my dad ended up losing his job. My mom always has worked as a direct support professional in her entire life, so she didn't really make a lot of money either. And I remember it was like, well, can I do this or can I do that and everything? And I tried to talk to them about different plans. And long story short, it just didn't end up working out. During that time, to be completely vulnerable and honest about the situation, I ended up falling into a very big depression. I felt like I wasted my time in Upward Bound because Upward Bound prepares us to go to college. And I was the one few person who just didn't go. So I felt guilty because I was basically taking advantage of this huge program that really helps support these students. And I'm like, this could have went to someone else who could have went to college. Mm. So I remember I told my dad, and my dad's like, well, hey, just because the dream dies doesn't mean the dream just ends. You know what I mean? It just means it has to be postponed. And I was like, no, but Dad, like, it's not going to happen. You know what I mean? And I was in that mindset. And I remember this time my dad said, well, hey, you got to pick yourself back up. So do something, you know, at least do something with your time. So I applied for a job at Sam's Club where I used to work in the meat department, you know, as a meat wrapper. So I used to wrap the meat, stock the shelves. You know what I mean? I used to even once in a while cut meat because some of my coworkers would teach me actually how to cut the meat in the office. And that was kind of cool and everything. And I ended up working that job for a whole year and a half. And long story short, I remember Brian Post, once again, shout out to Brian Post, the director of Upward Bound, has been trying to get in touch with me because I think what he did was he wanted to make sure we all went to college, but he heard that I didn't go to college because it's a very small town. Plattsburgh is a very small area, so it's kind of easy to figure out people and what people are doing. And so Brian has been trying to get in touch with me, and I kept on ignoring his calls because I felt, like I said, I felt ashamed. I felt horrible. You know what I mean? I didn't want to talk to him because I didn't want to admit to him that I couldn't go to college and everything. And I remember one day he actually went to Sam's Club itself. He was actually going shopping, and he bumped into me. And he goes, hey, Zach, what are you doing here? You know what I mean? And I was like, well, I'm actually here because, you know what I mean? I'm actually working. And he was like, oh, weren't you supposed to be in college? I think he knew it was kind of like a loaded question. So, you know, and I was like, yeah, that didn't work out and everything. And Brian's like, well, here, call my number. Don't feel shame. Don't feel guilt. Let's talk. You know what I mean? And I remember literally, so I was going to meet with Brian on my only day off. It was on, I want to say it was like a Tuesday or a Wednesday. I called Brian. You know, I was in Plattsburgh. And Brian actually brought me to this little sub restaurant that's famous in our town called Zook's Subs. And I remember we were having a Zook sub. And then basically, long story short, Brian was like, hey, you can still go to college. There's still possibility. You know, and don't let the dream die. Very echoing, very similar to what my dad told me. You know what I mean? He's like, sometimes, you know, life is not so linear. You know what I mean? I think sometimes we kind of go about things. We think that, oh, 1 + 1 has to equal 2. You know what I mean? But that's not always the case with life. There's always this hidden variables. So Brian's like, why don't we go back to the office, think about where you're going to apply to? You know what I mean? You have an idea what you wanted to do. And at that time, I actually wanted to be going to actually, like, fun fact, actually was more like in the ministry work because Christianity was a huge part of my life at that time. And so I was like, you know, I actually kind of want to go more into like becoming a history teacher because that was always the sub area I always wanted to go into as well. I'm like, I want to be a history professor, things like that. So Brian's like, do you know SUNY Plattsburgh has a great program? And I was like, they do. But to me, SUNY Plattsburgh was always the type of school that my mom, she used to work at SUNY Plattsburgh and basically the subsection of it, where she worked at Third Age Adult Day Center, where she worked with people who had Alzheimer's or other developmental disabilities. And so SUNY Plattsburgh was always like my home, even in SUNY Plattsburgh Upward Bound. So I roamed those halls ever since I was a young child. And I just thought it was too familiar, but I'm like, you know what, I'll apply for this. Long story short, I worked with Brian and I with Julie, my previous counselor, applied SUNY Plattsburgh, and I got in. And ever since then, I would say things have gone up. You know what I mean? I basically started studying history. You know what I mean? And then I remember things got a little more difficult. You know what I mean? So I ended up talking to my TRIO advisor because at that point they actually had TRIO Student Support Services, which is another TRIO program just like Upward Bound, but they help students while you're in college. And so I connected with my TRIO counselor, and I remember just talking to her about how difficult things were. And I told her I was falling out of love with the love of history that I once had. And I said, honestly, and I feel like this education system is just, you know, it's flawed. You know what I mean? Like, why is it that like people like me have to work twice as hard? Or why do I always feel like I'm so far behind, even though I know I'm 2 steps ahead? Right. And she really articulated to me what the first year college student was all about and that experience and what that truly felt like. And she said, rather than look at the negatives, look at it more as a positive. Like, this is a source of strength for you. You know what I mean? And so because of all those great things and all those interventions, I was like, well, what do I do? How do I change it? She's like, there's a program like that where you can work in higher education. You can make an impact on students' lives. I was like, what's that? And that's when we all have the Crezo light bulb of the student affairs higher education around. And I said, well, how do you do that? She's like, well, we actually have a program like here on our campus. You should reach out to the person who's chair that program, you know what I mean? And figure out what kind of things they would like to see. And that's what I did. So once my sophomore year happened, you know what I mean? I reached out to her and I realized that, hey, I really want to do the major of social work. Because that was really important to me. So I ended up doing the major of social work. And then I started looking at grad programs at the time. And like I said, I'm sure you're going to ask later questions about my more experience why I was in undergrad itself, because it relates to some things I got involved with. But because of that, I had a long tumultuous journey throughout my undergrad, and I had a lot of pain, but I also had a lot of joy. You know, I got involved in a lot of different things. I became a brother of Phi Mu Delta National Fraternity. You know what I mean? So that was amazing. But I also got to surround myself with a lot of like-minded people to kind of help propel me forward. And like I said, that kind of became my entrance into higher education. You know what I mean? As I understand what it was like to not have a college degree, which really truly made me appreciate what it was like to actually have one. And then when I went to Binghamton, like I said, what you mentioned before, and got the dual master's program in public administration, as well as in student affairs administration. You know what I mean? I ended up getting my first job at Corning Community College for TRIO Student Support Services, where I worked specifically with first generation college students and students with learning or physical disabilities. And I really loved that. And that was amazing. Even throughout my time in graduate school, I also worked as an RD, or what they called ARC. So it was basically a part-time RD who was a grad student. I also had a supervisor who was an RD, things like that. And all that type of stuff really just made me really appreciate higher education and the gift of a college education can actually truly have on so many different individuals and what people do with that gift moving forward. It truly inspired me, which then now lead me to my job at Albany, because unfortunately that job at Corning Community College that I got my last year of grad school, COVID hit. And so a lot of things happened. Budget cuts happened. We actually had the grant did not get renewed for my position. So I ended up having to find another job. And thankfully, Albany was hiring a university academic advisor where they were trying to implement a new 4-year advising model. So someone who has more of a holistic advising approach. And thankfully, they offered the job to me and along with, I want to say 8 or 9 other people. And so we call ourselves the COVID squad because we all hired all at once. And since I've been at Albany, and I said that's when I met Mike G as my supervisor. And the rest is history, you know?
Yeah, it's one of those things too, life always has the ups and downs, but it seems like at parts where you're kind of, maybe down with things that are happening, like you didn't necessarily seek out. So they just kind of happen to just show up and then kind of plant the seed and say, hey, do you know about this program or this program that then led you to these opportunities and taking advantage of those, which I think is fantastic. And then just kind of keeping that positive spirit throughout the whole thing. And a lot of it kind of starts with, was it Julie that kind of mentioned the Upward Bound program and kind of how things kind of came about afterwards. So I think that's a fantastic story. And you're able to share that not only on this podcast, but also with the students that you meet with. So kind of leading into that, first gen students, what would be your definition of a first generation college student? Because it seems like it's slightly different depending on institution that you're at.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I agree with you. I think the very definition of first generation college students is very difficult and something in the landscape I feel as a profession, I think we should try to address. But that's a whole nother conversation aside. But I define a first generation college student as a student whose neither parents have earned at least a bachelor's degree, regardless of other sibling status. So I have 2 older siblings, 2 older sisters who I love very dearly. You know what I mean? Neither of them actually got a college degree, except for one of my older sisters, Brittany. She actually ended up getting a college degree after I got mine because she was inspired by my work going back to college that she decided to continue that along as well. So at that point, even if she got before me, she would still be a first-year college student. I would still be a first-year college student because neither of our parents have earned at least a bachelor's degree.
Yeah, nice. And, we were mentioning earlier when we started the recording that this is going to be going out on the first week of November or first full week of November. So you have November 8th being the National First Generation College Celebration. What can you tell us about that? And is that something that Albany also celebrates?
Yeah, so this is actually a huge initiative that usually happens along a lot of other campuses. I can't say every single college does this, because obviously you really need to look into that as well. But basically, it's a date that's on like November 8th. It happens every single year. They call it National College Student Celebration Day. I know a lot because also a lot of times when the programs I was part of, like when it came to like trio and things like that, what ended up happening, they would always do an event that happened on this day. I know basically Albany, we basically started the push of actually supporting first generation students on an institutional level. And so because of that, lately, I would say we had a whole full week of events last year to really kick it off. It was the first time we've ever did something on that day and even that week, which was part of the part when I was actually in the first generation college student task force, student success task force. And so that was really kind of cool. And this year right now, I can't really tell you if there's anything much really going on. I know there's some offices trying to work on things. I know currently right now, because I'm one of those people, I'm a self-motivator. So even right now, I've already partnered up with, her name is Princess Otis, who works in the C-STEP and Project Excel program, which are two programs that actually work with a lot of first generation college students themselves. And I actually worked with her along with a newly found group on the first generation college student union that was actually, I helped actually start up at Albany. We're actually collaborating on an event called Leaving Our First Gen Mark. And basically what we're doing there is we're actually having this time where first generation college students can now showcase their artistic abilities, whether it be through music, through poetry, through a photograph, you know what I mean, through a painting, a dramatic scene, things like that. We're going to have people do that. And then what we're going to have people do is trace their hand. You know what I mean? And when they trace their hand, they're going to color in their hand and they're going to put their name in the middle. And in the middle of the poster board is going to have something along the lines of leaving my first gen mark at Albany. And what we're going to do is we're going to hang that poster board up for the rest of the month of November. It's at our campus center. And so we can, so all first gen students who see it are going to see everyone's handprints and everything all on the poster board, and also showcase the wonderful talent that exists within this amazing community here at Albany. So that's one thing I'm doing on the side. But like I said, I think the university is also planning to do other things as well. And I'm really hoping they do. But for right now, that's what I can tell you. As of right now, that's what's actually in the books.
Well, I think it's a very creative concept. And I hope you get a lot of students that participate in, because, yeah, I mean, sometimes you don't know what someone can do. And then you have a lot of these opportunities where it's painting, drawing, whatever it might be. And you can kind of see how creative our students really are and just how great they are. I mean, we already know they're great, but it makes them even greater. Now, in your bio, it's mentioned that there can be institutional and psychological barriers that exist for first generation college students. Talk to us more about that, and can you give us some examples?
Yeah. So one thing I would say when it comes to more of the institutional barriers, I think the hidden curriculum is huge. You know what I mean? Oftentimes when I talk to students, they always look to their peers because that's the only time you can really gauge. And a lot of my first-year college students feel like they're so far behind, or they're always 2 steps behind at always. And I think that's because, a lot of times when you have parents who actually go to college, you kind of have an idea how things operate and how things work. You know what I mean? Your parents kind of give you a rough idea. Obviously, things have changed even within the past year, within the past 10 years, 15, 20 years, even within the last month, to be honest, in higher education. But because of that, a lot of times these students, they look at their peers and like, well, they already get to go to financial aid. They already know how to understand their financial aid bill. Why don't I understand my financial bill? Is there something wrong with me? And I love to quote this one person when I actually held a presentation, when I actually talked about first-gen family achievement guilt, which goes into another issue, is family achievement guilt when it comes to more of the psychological barriers. But one woman said, it's crazy how when we define first-gen college students, we always say it's basically a student whose family does not have at least a bachelor's degree, with their parents, you know what I mean? And it's they're already operating at a deficit. You know what I mean? And that really hit me really hard. I was like, wow, that's crazy to think about. So we're already looking at these students at deficit. So anything when it comes to institutional barriers, you also have faculty who have an old school way of doing things. They may not realize they're doing this, or are implicit biases when they kind of come out. We always look at students who are deficit approach. You know what I mean? And we always say, oh, these students need our help. You know what I mean? Or there's something wrong with them, but there's nothing wrong with these people. It's a system that's put in play that's been difficult for them. It's a system in play that's not into their advantage. You know what I mean? So I think even just I'm becoming more aware. So I always tell people, as even my coworkers, if you see the hidden curriculum, don't make it hidden, make it known curriculum. Don't assume a first-generation college student, knows everything that's going on in the institution. Or also don't assume they don't know things that are going on in the institution, because some of them are very well aware. They know what they're doing and they're very intentional with what they do. The beauty of a first-year college student is they're not a monolith. You know what I mean? So they come from a lot of different backgrounds. They come from all different ways of life, different cultural, ethnic backgrounds, different abilities. You know what I mean? Different genders, sexual orientations, all that types of stuff. You know what I mean? And so we shouldn't be a monolith either as a professional when working with these students. You know, we shouldn't find one way of doing things. We need to be intentional, impactful. You know, connect with these students, be individualized. You know what I mean? When we work with these students, really get to know our students and talk to them more on an individual basis and kind of figure out how can we support them through their individual needs, because that's the best way we can best support this population, because they don't all look the same, you know?
Right. Yeah. Yeah, because I remember we were chatting prior to the recording, and I think this kind of a lot of it ties into it, is that you had mentioned that, especially when relating to student conversations, that like advisors, like, or even as students, like we don't see things as they are, but as we are.
Exactly.
And then you had also mentioned that, like, as advisors or advisory professionals, we really need to consider how concerning it might be to a student when we tell them, like, oh, go to this department, and then we kind of just like let them roam off, and hopefully they get there, and they may not know where that department is, or what to ask, or who could be a contact person for that. Now, I'm sure too, like, it always comes down to time constraints as well with our appointments. But for you, it's kind of like we really should go that extra mile to assist our students, no matter who they are, and ensure that they know what to do based off what information we give them.
Yeah, exactly. And I'd say do that across all your students.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? So whether this student's a first generation college student or not, all your students, when you refer to them research, so don't say go to a financial aid. Right. You know what I mean? Go to, like, let's say, Matt, I'm going to use an example because he's the easiest person I can see right now. But like, go to Matt Markin in financial aid. You know what I mean? And this is what the process is going to look like. Ask him these types of questions. Because the problem is you also want to develop like a normalcy, you know what I mean, amongst these students. Because then you don't have to worry about being super intentional with all your practice, or feel like you forgot something when you're working with a first year in college, because it's your natural practice to dismantle the hidden curriculum. Because the hidden curriculum is created because there's a lot of implicit biases. There's a lot of implicit systems or processes that exist in the college education system. So if you make it well known, it doesn't matter who you work with. The cool thing about me as a first year in college students is the practice you do with first year in college students, you can apply that to any student population, and they're only going to benefit from that service.
Right.
Yeah. So if you can practice that even with your non-first year college students, it's only going to impact your first year in college students when you work with them as well. So That's why I say refer them to people, because the campus itself, the hidden curriculum is large. Mm-hmm. Make campus feel small. Make it feel like a small-time campus. Albany is a huge college. You know what I mean? And so I tell people, make campus feel small by connecting to individuals, connect them with the process, give them that key, saying, hey, this is what the kind of questions they're going to ask you. These are the kind of things they're going to be looking for you. Do you know these questions? Do you want to brainstorm? People hate this, but I love role playing. So sometimes I'll even role play with my students about what the conversation is going to be like. Because then if they don't know something, it's okay. Then we can figure that out now, so you don't have to feel shameful when you do connect with that service and don't know that answer.
Yeah. Now, I mean, based off your experience too, like for you growing up and things that you've mentioned already, and, maybe as advisors working with students, is, you've mentioned the shame and the guilt part. And as much as, we can try to connect with our students, they might still continue to have that shame and guilt. Any advice for advisors when they are working with, whether it's first-gen students or anyone that is experiencing that shame and guilt?
Yeah, I always recommend people do is validate it. Mm-hmm. It's a very real feeling. I think the hard part is that when we work through people who have the shame and the guilt, and especially when it comes to first year and college students, is that you're not going to cure it. It's not going to come overnight. It's an endless struggle. What really helped me out a lot when I was an undergrad was someone actually validated, that's a great feeling. It's okay to have that feeling. Like, thank you for actually addressing that. Thank you for talking about that. And let's unpack this. What's going on in your life? And at that point, I remember telling my story. I tell this in my presentation about the story of my dad. When my dad got really sick, and I remember even having a conversation with my mom, being like, I don't know what's going to be life without having a father. Mm-hmm. I don't know what's going to be life without me having a husband. I felt so guilty because while I was going to college, I was an RA. I got to live in a place in a dorm, in a residence hall. Mm-hmm. But then what ended up happening is I ended up having my parents were calling me saying, hey, we may actually end up losing the house because of finances. Mm-hmm. And I was like, how is it fair that I got to live on a place on campus, but my family was struggling to find a place where they could be.
Right.
You know what I mean? I had a full meal I could go to. I could go to the dining hall, swipe my meal swipe. You know what I mean? You know what I mean? But my parents didn't know where the next meal was going to come from or how they're going to afford food. You know, things like that. And so that's a very big reality. So I think just validating that concern and knowing that you're not going to probably fix it, which kind of really sucks, especially working in a higher education profession. We're always here because we want to help students. We want to fix some of their problems. And it's horrible to say, but you're not here to fix anything. It's up to the onus of the student to make sense of their guilt, make sense of their shame. Because they may not come up to you and tell you, hey, I feel shameful, I feel guilty. Because I didn't do that when it came to my advisor at the time, my trio advisor, when I was experiencing that.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? They started to understand, oh, do you feel guilty? Like they actually brought that to me, like, well, do you feel guilty because all these things are happening?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And I was like, wow, that's a great way to put it. You know what I mean? And I didn't realize I was going through that until literally I came up with this presentation I did for NACADA. You know what I mean? That I realized that actually this is actually a common occurrence that actually a lot of students face. Even my job currently right now, and shout out to Mike G because we mentioned him before. I remember my second week of my job, my parents were having issues with their house. And I remember talking to Mike and being like, Mike, I can't be here. I have to go home. I'm going to have to leave my job. Thanks for the job. And I really appreciate this offer, but I got to go home. I got to find a job closer to home because my family's struggling. And I feel guilty being at Albany because I make more money than both my parents did combined. You know, and I'm like, I can't do this. Yeah, I have to go home. And Mike was like, this is exactly why you're here. You know what I mean? This is why we want you in this office. This is your value. This is what you bring to our office because we know you can leave this office, that's fine. But I want to let you know what you're going through right now is going to be a huge impact on the story of these students that you talk with. You're going to be able to connect with them on such a deeper level that some other person can't because you're going through this right now. And you're also not only making yourself better as an advisor, but you're making our staff better by you just being here. You telling me this story by going through what you're going through because you will bring a value to not only your role, but also to our institution. And because of that long conversation, we also have a lot of personal things. Mike actually grounded me. And I was like, you know what? He was right. You know what I mean? And I'm so glad I stayed here, you know, because now I got to make an impact on all of these students. If it wasn't for Mike actually taking time out of his busy day, being my supervisor, you know what I mean, to really connect with me and really help me understand and validate that guilt, I don't know if I would even be here talking to you right now, man, you know? And that's the beauty of it, you know what I mean? And I wouldn't be able to even find my niche within our office as well, working with first generation college students. So to answer your question, I think just validate the guilt, be there with them, talk to them, articulate the college process. You know what I mean? Just give them that extra mile. One of my coworkers, John Martinez, who I love very much as well, which as you can tell, I give a lot of love to a lot of people. So I apologize. But he always says the greatest gift we can give our students is our time. And that's a privilege. You know, it's a privilege that these students, that we are able to actually have that much of an impact on these students' lives. So we need to take this privilege of giving them that time, you know, and use it to our best of our ability. You know what I mean? And to make an impact on these students. So use that time to really sit with them, talk with them, connect with them after, follow up. Yeah, hey, I know you talked to me about this. How are things going? You know, like you said, we mentioned before, just make campus feel smaller and make them feel seen, heard, and valued. And let them know that they are a value member of our institution, our profession, all that type of stuff, because they are, and they truly do every single day. And they remind me, like Mike, you said before, Mike reminds me of my why. My students every single day remind me of my why. And I let students know that on a daily basis. Like, I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for all of you here coming to my house and talking to me about these things.
Never apologize for giving shout outs. I mean, where we're at based off other people that have mentored us or been part of our lives that have helped us. That's, you know, even just one little quote that just led us on a different trajectory. So, you know, we got to give people their kudos, their flowers. So yeah, never apologize for that. You know, you were mentioning the presentation for NACADA. So that one was a co-presentation, I think you did. So that one was called Breaking Barriers, Empowering Resilience, Overcoming Family Achievement Guilt and First Generation College Students. What was your experience like, and how do you feel things went with your presentation?
Yeah, I think it was amazing. And shout out once again, Shannon Sousa. I see you, my co-presenter. She was amazing. We did a lot of great work together. I would say since we've actually gonna call it like a joke around and call it our tour. So I love music. So I call it like basically we're like a band and going on tour because we not only present for NACADA, but we also present a lot of smaller colleges as well. You know, because of our presentation at NACADA Region 1, we a lot of people reach out to us asking us, hey, can you actually present for our college? We actually would love to hear that. You know, and so we're actually bringing this message to the masses. which was actually kind of cool. And the research that we stumbled across, and we even brought that researcher to all these other people who work with first year in college and let them know, like, hey, this research actually exists.
Yeah.
And so that presentation was so cathartic, and I think for me, it really kind of helped me actually make some closure on some of the feelings that I actually had. It also made me make sense of a lot of those things as well. And it just rejuvenated my love of this profession of higher education. It rejuvenated based on my experience. And that so cool is that we have so many great people who are working in the work, doing the great work inside the professions of higher education and doing amazing work. And not only that, but they're also making such a huge impact on our students. It also makes us realize how human we are as well. Like I've actually had people personally message me on the Nakata app or even through my LinkedIn. You know what I mean? Being like, hey, I finally felt heard and seen for something I've been experiencing that I just never knew it actually happened.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And so things like that were just incredible. You know what I mean? Another one as well as I remember even when we presented at Region 1, we actually had this one advisor who was talking about how he was working with a student. You know what I mean? And going through this guilt and all this kind of stuff. And it was so magical. And the person who was talking about was also in that audience as well. And he did not realize that. And that's something we didn't even set up beforehand.
Wow.
And so it's been such like a magical, beautiful moment. And it also has been giving so many professionals who are doing this great work that affirmation, like, no, you're doing the great work. Keep it up. You know what I mean? But it also gives people who may not actually think about this as a concept to also be like, you know what, maybe I should start talking to my students, have deeper conversations, and like actually talk to my students who are experiencing this. And I actually take the time to actually make word for this. So that's also been really great as well. But like I said, it literally has just been beautiful. And I've even tried to be even more intentional now that I know this research exists to even talk to my students more in a more intentional conversation about this. I also am fortunate enough to teach a 0 credit first gen seminar class. First gen college student seminar at Albany. And so I've even incorporated this whole lesson into my curriculum.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? As well.
Well, let's talk about the class because you just mentioned it's 0 units. So is this, it's 2 units?
Yeah, 0 units.
0. Okay. So how is it a requirement or how do you get students to kind of join in to take this class?
Yeah. So usually what we do is basically we'll have is advisors, when they go through their file, we make schedules for students here at Albany. So we'll go through, we have a batch of students we go through, we'll look through their file, and then what we'll do is we'll look through it, make their schedule, and then we'll send it out to the student. And if they want to make changes, then we obviously will make a few changes, things like that, based on their needs. So basically what we do is we kind of leave it up to the advisor itself, kind of go through their file, because when they look through their student application, it will say, your parents' level of education. So they'll look through, and if they actually have the definition that I just mentioned earlier in this podcast, that they'll go through and they'll be like, okay, this is a first-year college student. Do I think they would benefit from them? I'll put them in the class. Okay. And so basically, advisor will actually place those people in the class. We used to also teach in the spring semester where students will opt into the class. And so usually that will happen by advisors talking to their students about it. Or no, I will also talk to some of my students about it. I'll even send an email to all first-gen students that I've worked with in the past or present to have them enroll in this class. But this spring, we're actually not going to do it in the spring just because we have some unique plans that we're going to do for a fall. So I won't mention all those because I'm still trying to work all that kind of stuff out. But basically, we just have people place them in the class. And then I even tell the students straight up, like, this is a 0 class. You don't have to be here. But if you really want to actually engage in this, I can guarantee you're going to take away something beautiful in this class. And it's only for 8 weeks. You know what I mean? So it doesn't take up most of the semester. It's only for around an hour. And I tell students, if you want to show up, you're going to take away something. Or you may not realize you're going to take away something until the very end. And then that's when things change. And so because of that, we go through different lesson plans. I have things where we have talk about financial aid. And not only do we go through their financial aid bill, but we also talk about some deeper things. Like if you can't afford college, what's that like? Yeah. You know what I mean? We also go through the social environment itself. Like, how do you get involved on campus? You know what I mean? The importance of understanding your first-gen identity and what that truly means to you. Understanding the college experience is a varied experience. It's not just a one and done. Everyone has varying difficulties or even achievements that they accomplish when they're in college, things like that. So we talk about those types of things. And now I said before, I'm trying to bring in the achievement guilt because it actually brought about one of my students, what actually is why I did the presentation, was because we were talking about well-being and the importance of mental health, because mental health is a huge passion of mine as well. My father has bipolar depression. So me trying to bring people out to the masses, understand what depression, mental health, things that are super important. And we're talking about well-being and dismantling the stigmas that exist when it comes to mental health. And I remember how one of my students who actually mentioned to me in the class was like, hey, I feel like I have to sacrifice part of myself just to succeed in college. But then when I go back home, I have to sacrifice what I learned in college just to fit in with my family. Then when I come back to college, I just feel like I'm a walking shell of a person because I don't know who I am anymore. Is that normal? And how do you expect to retain someone who doesn't even know who they are?
Right.
And then I remember they told me that in my class when we're just talking about well-being and how things people are doing. And that hit me like a truck, Matt. You know what I mean? I was just like, oh my gosh. And I remember I even got a little teary-eyed because I was going through the same thing when I was an undergrad. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
They didn't know this, but like when I was going through that, I was even experiencing that in my professional career as well. And I had to tell and I went up to the student, I was like, you know what? It doesn't go away.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And it's not going away, but I'm always reminded of it. But instead of running away from it like I used to in the past, I made sense with it. I use it to empower me. And I tell that to all my students, is like, use your first gen story to empower you moving forward. You are a pioneer. You are a trailblazer. You're a leader. All these types of things.
Right.
But that's a long story short to tell you why the Uni 9 exists and why people register the class. But the great things that actually exist within the Uni 9 has been truly a beautiful, beautiful thing for me.
Yeah. Now I'm interested in another presentation that you did. I think this was a few years ago, so it's like 2019. So this was I think around the time that you were an assistant residential coordinator. But you did one called "Making the Invisible Visible," working with first-gen college students in the residence hall. So I was interested to know about kind of the backstory behind that one.
Oh wow, that's a deep cut. Let's
Yeah.
go. Yeah. So basically what we did is for Residence Life, they basically had a call for proposals to actually present for RAs and stuff on how to work with certain students, you know what I mean, or certain student groups, you know what I mean. And a lot of my RAs who I actually supervised knew I was a first gen. Like, Zach, I think you should do a presentation on first gen because a lot of the first gens just aren't coming to our programs. They're not getting involved in the campus community. They don't really feel like a sense of belonging. So I was like, okay, maybe if my RAs are struggling how to engage with first-gen students, I'm sure this is something I'm big into university's campus. That's a huge issue as well. So I literally submitted a proposal for RA training, you know, which was entitled that same exact presentation that you just talked about. You know what I mean? So one thing I would say is what I did was I kind of just talked about how do we actually make these first-generation college students feel heard? You know, how do we make them feel seen in the residence halls? You know what I mean? You know, because a lot of times RAs would just go away, oh, I advertised my program, but they didn't get it or they didn't understand and things like that. So I basically try to give them step-by-step presentation on actually how to engage with these students, like build the connection with them, talk to them. You know what I mean? Once again, dismantle the hidden curriculum. You know what I mean? They may not realize that RAs do programming every single semester. You know what I mean? They may not realize that they can go to an RA to talk to them about issues that they're experiencing about college as a whole. You know what I mean? Their sense of belonging, they probably don't understand because you haven't specifically invited them or talked to them. So they know they can actually attend that meeting that you're trying to have or that program that you're doing. So it kind of just gave tips for a lot of other resident assistants and also resident directors who were in attendance. How do you actually work with a first generation college student population when it actually comes to the residence hall itself?
Nice. I feel that could be like a rolling presentation you can do at various schools and conferences. So if you have, maybe dust that one off too and keep doing that one.
Oh, thank you.
Now, other things that you've been part of, you know, you talked a little bit about being part of Albany's first gen college student success task force. You're currently on NACADA's first gen AC steering committee. What's been your experience like on the steering committee, and you know, what are some of the goals that the steering committee is looking to accomplish?
Yeah. So my experience on the steering committee has been absolutely incredible. I think it's so awesome to see other first gen, now they're maybe professionals, you know, who actually work proud first generation graduates, you know what I mean? But also people who work directly with first gen students. So the cool thing about me is, yes, I do that intertwined in my job working with first gen students, but I also see all types of students. You know, I just have a special affinity for the group because that's the group that I'm a part of. But even just kind of getting their feedback, talking about what kind of trends they're seeing, kind of their experiences, what their institutions are doing when it comes to supporting first-gen students. For me, like I said, supporting this population has always been at Albany, but now we're starting to put that a little bit more at the forefront than we have in the past. So kind of getting their feedback, their mentorship, you know, has also been incredible. Some of the goals we even tried to do this semester, well, this whole year, I would say, is put out some really great programming. You know what I mean? Like, don't worry so much about the quantity of your program, but the quality of your programs. And so because I felt like we've actually been having a really high attendance to a lot of events that we've been holding, like, rather than doing 8 things half-assed, you know what I mean? Or very not really planned out or really thought about, let's actually be really intentional with our programming. Let's also get people who are part of our steering committee who actually have a great skill set, and let's bring them in to lead those presentations, have them talk about those types of things. And so that's one of the things we've been doing a lot when it comes to things like that. We've also been trying to build more on our community as well. Actually, because that's what I tell people, we're an advising community. Let's actually be a community. Let's support one another. Let's show up when someone's presenting at a NACADA conference, which we actually had a lot of other great people in our community actually present for NACADA. So do we show up to their programs? Send them messages like, hey, I know you're presenting today. Good luck. You got this. Yeah. You know what I mean? Things that let people know that they're valued and they're appreciated. So that's another thing we've also been trying to do too. And right now we're always trying to get the word out there. Let know that our community actually exists, and their advising committee, our steering committee also exists. So if you want to get involved, that's a way you can also get involved as well. But I'd say be more intentional with our programming, but also be more intentional with our communications to one another. And actually, don't just meet once a month for a steering committee meeting. Let's meet outside as well. You know what I mean? I'll give you an example. Like, I had one of the people who was actually on the steering committee. His name is Moises. I always joke around calling Moises the legend. And we always joke around about that. And he always laughs. But he reached out to me. He was like, hey, I'm trying to engage my first generation college students who I work with in a PowerPoint. And he's like, I need the Zach Flair, because the Zach Flair is like super engaging, high energy, things like that. Let me know some tips for a PowerPoint. And I literally sent him a message. Yeah. You know what I mean? And I was like, hey, this is what I do in my presentations. I had memes. I make jokes. You know what I mean? I also try to be more engaged. If I'm excited about it, then other people are going to be excited about it as well. So even just little things like that, talking to one another, even outside the meetings, to kind of develop not only as us as people, but us as professionals as well. Because that's what it's all about. Like NACADA is wonderful at, is the networking opportunities we have. So let's do more of those opportunities to connect with one another, not through our identity of being a first generation college graduate, but also through the work that we do as well.
Nice. Well, I think that's a great way to end the more advising related questions of this interview. But as we wrap up, I asked Mike G to give me some questions I could ask Zach to end this interview that are non-advising related. So his first question said, you need to ask Zach is, where did the nickname Yogi come from?
Oh, wow. Okay. So actually it's like a twofold thing. So one is when I actually worked at Sam's Club. People were like, you're a big guy. So I'm like 6'2". I'm built like a linebacker for the football, for the NFL. You know what I mean? But everyone just says I'm just a bundle of joy and optimism. People even joke around, call me Optimus Prime. That's Transformers reference for all you lovely nerds like myself. And basically what happened, they kind of say, but you're like a bear. You got a beard. You're just a big guy, all this kind of stuff. We should call you Yogi. You know what I mean? And so they kind of worked at Sam's Club for a little bit. And then eventually what ended up happening was when I actually worked at SUNY Plattsburgh in my undergrad, I left Sam's Club and actually decided to take a plunge. Once I decided I wanted to do student affairs, I actually became an orientation leader. And when I became an orientation leader, that was my first introduction. Like, this is how higher ed, this is actually working for the college. This is what it's all about, things like that. And I remember, I think it was the second or third week, I actually had a bunch of students go like, wow, you're just always laughing. You're always smiling. You know what I mean? You're just like really happy to be here. You're high energy. You remind me of a bear. And I was like, oh, here we go again. You know what I mean? And you're a big guy. You're just like a giant teddy bear. And I was like, well, whatever you do, just don't call me Pooh Bear. So fun fact, my mom loves Winnie the Pooh. And so I was like, don't call me Pooh Bear because it reminds me of my mom. You know what I mean? And they're like, no, you're not Pooh Bear. You're more like a Yogi Bear. And at that time when I became an orientation leader, I was a sophomore. So you think about the incoming class as freshmen, first year students. So they ended up just calling me Yogi, like, hey, Yogi, what's up, Yogi? What's all that kind of stuff. So eventually people thought that was actually my real name. And it actually wasn't Zach. And so because I was a freshman class, then the year after that, those people start calling me Yogi. And so it became this like giant like cult following of my name being nicknamed as Yogi. You know what I mean? So eventually everyone started calling me that. And so people say you should start introducing yourself as Yogi. And it became like more of like a term of endearment. You know what I mean? So even my students who, when I was an RA, they were, oh my God, that's Yogi. Yogi's my RA. I'm like, no, my name is Zach. Like, no, it's Yogi. So they would take off Zach every single time on my door and say, put Yogi instead. So then I would change my name to Yogi. on my door. And it just became this cult following of people just calling me Yogi. And eventually people thought that was actually my name. And it just kind of transpired when I went to grad school. Because all my grad friends were like, oh my gosh, like Yogi's so much of a cooler name. You should just have people call you Yogi. So my residents started calling me that because they started calling me that. So then my RAs thought that was my name because that's what my RD and my supervisors would call me. You know what I mean? And it just became, my name kind of got lost. It wasn't Zach anymore. It was Yogi. So
I can imagine. And if it ever happened, then people getting confused. And then once someone says Zach and you answer to Zach, and they're like, wait, that's not his name.
No, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. I remember when people too who were like always on me on Facebook. I tried to look up Yogi on Facebook, or even like a LinkedIn. And I said, like, you go by Zach. Is that your real name? I'm like, yeah, Zachary is my real name. Thank you.
So the next question is, where did your love for bass guitar come from?
Oh, that's a great question. Okay, so I'm a huge metal fan. I also love prog rock, thanks to my mother. My mom loves Genesis, Phil Collins, Peter Gabriel, all that kind of stuff, King Crimson, Rush, all that types of stuff. So I remember first of all, I remember listening to Black Sabbath's self-titled album when I was younger because I got into classic rock. Because my dad's like, hey, you should check this band out. You know what I mean? And I remember listening to Geezer Butler for the first time, and I was like, ooh, that's a bass. Like, that sounds really kind of cool. You know what I mean? And I remember I was even learning the guitar at that time. And then what ended up happening was I have big hands, so people always joke around my bear paws, because my hands are huge because of Yogi, and then what ended up happening is I'm like, I actually like bass because I really love understanding the rhythm section. Like, I love how bass is not necessarily a flashy instrument, like it can be if you want it to be. But when people are dancing, they're not going to lead guitar shredding, you know what I mean? They're going to the bass and the drums. And I always thought that would be so cool. So you're kind of like that like secret weapon in a band. Because when people are grooving, they're grooving to the bass beat. And so for me, which I just did right now, but they groove to that. And so I was like, that's so cool. So you're not like a show-offy person, because I'm not a show-offy person. I don't really like to tell people what is it I do, or even brag about those things. So I like to be more behind the scenes, because even just me seeing the work being done is enough joy for me. And that's the way it's in with bass. You know what I mean? It's not, you're not doing crazy things, but you're basically in the background just letting people know, like, oh, hey, that when you're bobbing your head, you're moving around, you're moving because of the bass player, and people don't realize that. So I'd say because of Geezer Butler, Tony Levin, who's the bass player, and Peter Gabriel, and then Lee Sklar, who's actually the solo bassist for basically Phil Collins, is why I love bass the way I do. And because of that, and because I got bass lessons from my old youth pastor when I was in high school, made me really appreciate the bass.
Nice. And last question is, who is your favorite artist or band?
Ooh, okay, that's really hard. Okay, so actually I have multiple, but I guess if I had to pick who, I would say Phil Collins or Genesis. I put them in the same category. Sure. And same with Peter Gabriel, all those things. So it's very, very sentimental to me because my mom, when I was younger, used to always sing You'll Be in My Heart by Phil Collins a lot. Whenever I used to get cranky. Tarzan, we talk about because I'm a 90s child. Yeah. So people always say when you're in the 90s, as a 90s child, you always have your favorite Disney movie, and mine happens to be Tarzan. I love Tarzan. And Phil Collins, he went hard on that album and that soundtrack, and he didn't have to. And for that, I'm forever thankful because it was a great album. So I love that. But I also love my favorite metal band, if I had to pick, is a band called Demon Hunter. I love Demon Hunter. They're a very heavy band. But they also are very melodic as well. They're the ones who can do heavy, Metallica style riffing for those who know metal. But they can also do very soft stuff as well, like acoustic type stuff. And I really love that dichotomy between the both. But my heart says Peter Gabriel, but my metalhead enemy says Demon Hunter. So,
well, the Phil Collins song, I mean, it's a great song, but I just find it amusing just how hard he did go on that song for a Tarzan Disney movie.
Oh my God, yeah, you're telling me that. I feel like they're like, hey, Phil, don't write a fire album. You just need to write something that's going to be okay, for Disney audiences. People can sing along, but Phil's like, okay, proceeds to write fire on the piano. All that kind of stuff. He just nailed that album. And like I said, Tarzan is one of my favorite Disney movies, so really, it's great. So I love that soundtrack. Even to this day, I listen to it.
Well, it's like if someone brings up Peebo Bryson, I'm like, I just immediately think Disney.
Oh no, exactly. Yeah, and then he did the same thing on the Brother Bear soundtrack, which is a movie that came out a little bit later. So Phil, if you're watching this, which if he is, thanks, Phil. But I love you. You know what I mean? You did great. And can I tell a quick story about that? Cool, sure. Too, as well.
Yeah.
So Phil Collins, I remember even it was like in 2021, maybe it was. I remember one of the biggest gifts I ever gave my mom was actually when I bought her tickets to go see Genesis at
Mhm.
TD Bank in Boston. I brought my mom and my dad to go see a Genesis concert. And I did that, because that was the first time I'm like, wow, I actually have money to actually go see a really big band. We actually got to be really close to the set itself, the stage. And I
Yeah.
remember just crying at that concert because that was one of the very last concerts Phil Collins ever did in North
Yeah.
America before he announced retirement. It was like the second to last one. And that was like one of the most magical moments is being able to sing Phil Collins and Genesis songs with my mom. Because
Oh
like I said,
yeah.
that's what my mom and I are very like passionate about. My mom really introduced me to music at such a young age.
Mhm.
You know what I mean? And so because I'm glad I got to share that moment with my mom because Phil, you nailed it that concert and it was amazing.
Yeah. No, that's just like my favorite band is Queen, and it's
Oh,
just like
Freddie.
growing up with that, and it's just like I'm gonna see them actually next month, but it's gonna be
Uh,
special, but knowing that it's like Freddie is not there, and so
yeah.
having missed out on that, like but such a great voice, and I guess we could talk about music for a long time with this, but Zach, it's been great for you to be on the podcast. Very interesting, entertaining stories, getting to know you and getting to share this out to our listeners and learning more about first gen students, especially celebrating first gen day on November 8th. But Zach, thank you again for being on the podcast.
No, thank you so much for having me. This has been fantastic. And if you're a first generation college student graduate, you did it. Congratulations. You know what I mean? We stand together and feel free to connect with me anyway. If you want to talk to me on LinkedIn, like Matt mentioned before, I have a LinkedIn. I love talking to different professionals from all around the area. So thanks for having me, Matt. And let's go. This is exciting.